SWIG, Social Worker Issues Group from UNISON, and I am a group of a team who arrange these webinars. So thank you everyone for coming along. Hi and thank you and welcome. This is the 29th webinar of Radical Social Work, and the subject is neurodiversity and autism. Just a couple of points first. Can everybody who isn't speaking please switch off the cameras and microphones, because that improves the quality of sound. We've got a limited bandwidth and when we have over 100 people here, which is fantastic, but to improve the quality of sound, and please can you switch off your microphones and your cameras unless you're speaking, or one of the group leading. Now we've got today a couple of speakers who are going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then there's going to be questions after that. Now if you could put your questions in the chat function, and John Watson, one of my colleagues, will scroll down the chat function and bring out the pertinent subjects of the questions after the two speakers speak. And we'll try and have a response to the questions from the panel today at the end after the two speakers speak. Apologies also that this is a fairly well, it's completely male-dominated gender imbalance. Apologies for that. We do try and get a more gender balanced a group speaking these webinars, so apologies for that. Also, just a couple of plugs. Can I make a couple of plugs to everybody? First is the Pride in Practice conference that UNISON have supporting on the 29th and 30th of May. There's still places for that, so that's Pride in Practice, 29th and 30th of May. So a few spaces for those who may wish to attend that conference. And secondly, on the 21st of May, there's a webinar that some of the Social Work Issues group have set up on case management, and it's similar to this webinar, but those who are involved in case management, I recommend that you attend the webinar on the 21st of May, same time, 1 o'clock, same format, to look critically and analyse critically the case management in social work over the last 30 odd years. So please sign up for that and come along. So just moving on to the subject of our webinar today, neurodiversity and autism. Now we recognise that this is a massive subject, and we're only going to touch a little bit of it today. So hopefully, along with the tradition of the Radical Social Work webinars, our two speakers will bring out some issues in relation to this in social work for us to reflect on and maybe give some pretty critical analysis of where we are in relation to neurodiversity and autism in social work today. I remember 40 years ago when I first started social work, or near enough, autism was a very rare thing to be diagnosed, and neurodiversity, well, the words hadn't even been heard by me. I'd never heard of that terms. Now 1 to 2% of people it's been suggested have autism, and maybe between 20 and 30% of people it's been suggested are neurodiverse. So that's changed the way we work in this area in social work. So hopefully we can bring some of that out today. Can I start off by introducing our first speaker, Ramon Hutchinson, who is presently a project manager at South Lanarkshire's Autism Resource and Coordination Hub, or Hatch, is that right?
Arch.
Right. He tells me he's been a social worker now for just 37 years, so quite new on the block. and in children and families, most of that, but a manager in where he is at the moment for quite a few years now. Also, that he's got 4 children, one of whom has been assessed as neurodiverse. So, Ramon, over to you.
Right, can I start by saying a few caveats first? First, I can't find my UNISON presentation in the PowerPoint for a start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the UNISON PowerPoint that I prepared for this meeting that I gave to the organisers. I don't know whether they can put it up. That would probably make more sense because I cannot find it in my sharing. I've got various presentations there, but I can't find the one that I sent on called the UNISON presentation. If you can't do that, then I will just use my own presentation and talk to that. That's the first thing. If that's okay with everybody, it makes sense. I've prepared a presentation for 20 minutes. The one that I put up there that I shared, I suddenly realised was for our awareness session, which is like over an hour or 2 hours almost. So I know you're not going to have that amount of time. So if the organisers can put up the UNISON presentation that I prepared, that might be yes, that's the one. Yeah, now do I control that, or will you control that? Irina?
You can start control. If there is a problem, I take control over, okay?
Okay, so I can just press take control, yeah. Irina? Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let me just make sure that's the right one. Yes, it is. That's that problem over with, that technical issue over with. The next thing is an obvious thing. I sound like Morgan Freeman, and I don't normally sound like this. I've got a really hoarse throat. I've got a kind of bit of a throat infection. But if anybody will listen to my rants, then I will talk to anybody, particularly about autism and generally neurodiversity in general. And the third caveat is basically, and yes, there's a few questions about can these slides be shared, and yes, of course they can. But basically, the third caveat is that this is a huge subject, as has already been said, and there's no way that I'm going to encapsulate that in 20 minutes. I could maybe do it in half a day or a day, but I'm not going to do it in 20 minutes. So this is going to be a whistle-stop tour. I'm going to do my best as long as my throat holds out. And obviously, after John does his presentation from the lived and living experience, I'll be more than ready to listen to your questions and hopefully give some answers. So hope that makes some sense. All right, so without much ado, let's crack on. So, wait a minute. It's not letting me move. Oh yeah. There we go. Right. So, the reason I started with this quote, this is something that I usually end my presentations on. So the reason that I started this is just to kind of lay out the fact that this is a massive, massive subject, a massive area, and I could bore you with lots and lots of the kind of medical terminology, which isn't particularly helpful. You know that autism is a pervasive neurodevelopmental condition that is characterised by social interaction, social communication, and social imagination difficulties or challenges, and restrictive interests and behaviours. So I could tell you that, and we could then talk about Kanner's classic autism, but everybody would fall asleep. So I try not and do that. And basically, my perspective very much is about the lived and living experience as well. So again, forgive the throat. Can everybody make out what I'm saying? Okay. So what I'm going to start out with saying, I love this quote, that data is so important, particularly for our community. And it's only when you look at some of the data that you suddenly realise that the generational, the systemic and structural inequalities that our community has faced for generations is considerable. So I don't know why it's not letting me. Oh, here we go. Right. In terms of the Cambridge Autism Research Centre in 2021, the prevalence figures were about 1 in 57. So I tried to translate that for the population of Lanarkshire, and then I tried to extrapolate that for the UK-wide population. So 1.75% in Lanarkshire is about 11,500 families and individuals, and in the UK, it's far higher than that. So about 660,000 families and individuals. It roughly equates to the same prevalence figures of the Centre for Disease control in the States. That's basically one of the biggest institutes in the world that does research into this subject. And in 2020, they concluded that prevalence figures had increased. In the 2000s and 2010 onwards, it went from about 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 100, and it's now kind of increasing to 1 in 57. Now, there's a lot of autism deniers in the community. There's a lot of people saying, oh, it's just in the imagination of professionals, and I would challenge that. When you understand how rigorous the diagnostic process is and how rigorous the process that individuals have to go through, you would understand that it wouldn't be an easy condition to manufacture. In terms of male-to-female ratio, traditionally it's been held to be about 4 males to 1 female, but we know that that's not accurate, largely because in the past, diagnostic criteria and diagnostic tools have been largely orientated towards the male brain, the male presentation, which in many respects can be quite different from the female presentation. We know that females, autistic females, mask far more, that they are more socially aware. It's sometimes called the chameleon effect or the camouflage effect, and that has made diagnostics much more difficult. So we know that there are many, many undiagnosed women in our community who go about their lives trying to cope and really no kind of understanding why many of the challenges that they face are there. And that's really, really sad, but something that we see on a regular basis. We know that about 1 in 100, roughly, of autistic people have a demand avoidant profile. There is an organisation called the PDA Society, that's pathological demand avoidance. We avoid that terminology because pathological demand avoidance is by definition pathologising, and we avoid that at all costs. And I think in general, the professional community has moved away from that kind of pejorative terminology to extreme demand avoidance. And if the community wants to keep PDA, it can be called a persistent drive for autonomy or a pervasive drive for autonomy. So really, the profile of autistic people who have that particular profile can be quite different from the traditional profile in that there is a lot of manipulative techniques. There can be a lot of lying in order to maintain control of situation in people. So it can often be misdiagnosed or confused with other conditions. We know that 70% of autistic people have coexisting mental health problems. You may want to ask yourself, is that because they have endemic mental health problems, or is that because they are in a society that doesn't understand them, that doesn't give them the kind of reasonable adjustments that they need in order to thrive and not just survive? And I think that would leave that open to you for your own speculation. 50 to 70% of autistic people have comorbid ADHD. This is what we call autism and ADHD combined. And that's a particular challenge because there are many aspects of each condition that overlap, but there are also many aspects that conflict with one another. One being on ADHD, the constant need for stimulation, and for autistic people, the need for continuity, sameness, and predictability. So they can often be at odds with each other, and you can imagine that being in the same person. It can sometimes create really considerable problems in terms of the cognitive overload. And some are surprised by this, including some colleagues within health services in particular, that the most recent research that was a meta-analysis that was done by Autistica and a considerable bit of research clearly showed that 2 or 3 autistic people do not have an ID and intellectual disability. So the vast majority of autistic people are what perhaps previously would have been called high functioning and what we would call lower support needs. But nonetheless, low support needs doesn't mean no support needs. And I think that that's the great danger in using terms like low functioning and high functioning, because there's a whole load of assumptions come with those labels. Every autistic person requires support of varying degrees. And I think that that's really important to understand, but also that only 1 in 3 have an actual intellectual disability, which I think is defined as an IQ of below 70. And in the past, it's perhaps been easier for professionals and services to target their resources and their supports for those with the most obvious disabilities, and that's why autism is sometimes called a hidden disability or a hidden diffability, as I prefer to call it, differently abled as opposed to disabled. Come on to terminology in another slide. So, and I think 80%, the sad fact is that in the absence of reasonable adjustments within the workplace and within the community and within education, that 80% of our autistic adults have no employment, education or training opportunities, so no positive destinations. And that's a huge waste. We know that from huge studies that have been undertaken, one being the micro-segmentation report that was undertaken in 2018 by the London School of Economics combined with Strathclyde Uni's economics department, where we basically, it was clearly articulated that, you know, the costs for autism far outweigh the costs for Scotland's 5 top killers, for example, you know, dementia, diabetes, stroke, heart, and diabetes, dementia, stroke, heart, and one of the cancer. So the top 5 killers in Scotland actually don't cost as much as the losses that autism costs the economy. And if we just invested a small amount of money in supporting our autistic community, there would be massive benefits for them in terms of quality of life outcomes and massive benefits for us as a community, as well as creating a more equitable and fair Scotland. So, and I'm no used to kind of doing monologues like this. I'm usually into dialogue, so I'm used to kind of people asking me questions during our awareness sessions, so forgive me. I'll try my best to kind of keep it at a pace that's reasonable. How do autistic people express their autism? Well, it can be in social awkwardness, so that's lack of social cognition. First and foremost, autism is about social cognition, about understanding social situations, about what to say in social situations, how to read social situations and people. It's about rejection sensitivity. Many of our community, I really need to kind of avoid making general statements because one word is describing a million different stories. But many in our community share this rejection sensitivity, sometimes called rejection sensitive dysphoria, where the impact of what's perceived as rejection can have huge impacts in terms of emotional well-being and obviously depression and anxiety. Literal or all or nothing thinking, you know, not having an understanding of the kind of nuances of conversation, like social pragmatics or neologisms, as they're called. You know, having like saying to some autistic people it's raining cats and dogs, they may well be looking for literally cats and dogs coming for the sky. That's a gross generalization, but many autistic people struggle with those types of subtle social communications that we take for granted, and that can often lead to misunderstandings within the workplace in particular. Sensory issues, and I've said there we don't just have 5. It's interesting when I usually ask audiences to name the senses, they always come up with the 5. You know, the touch, the sight, taste, hearing, and the other one. But basically they come up with the 5 senses. And there's loads of others. You know, there's things like neuroception, which is a sense of understanding other people's intent. It's a safety, it's a hardwired safety perception that we have. There's chronoception, which is the understanding of time. There's thermoception, which is the understanding of temperature. There's interoception, which is the understanding of your internal organs. These are all senses that we all share and that many people are not aware of, but that many people in our community really struggle with. So, for example, no understanding that you may be needing to drink, that you're dehydrated, can often cause problems, or no understanding when you need to eat, or being so focused on a task or an activity that you just forget to eat or you forget to drink. These are issues that are particularly for autistic children in schools are obviously a challenge. Processing issues, taking time to understand what's actually been meant and taking time to make an appropriate response as opposed to being forced into making a response there and there. For example, I'm thinking about an interview situation. how many interviews have you guys been, or you, what audience here, have been at, where you're expected to make an immediate response and your capacity to respond is judged as your capacity to, as competent. Whereas if you have a delayed processing issue and you may like to reflect on things, you may well have a much more qualitative answer if you had time to process that, but you can't do it on the spot. So that's another issue that many of our community are sometimes misunderstood in terms of their time for taking issues in and for digesting them and then making appropriate responses. It can also be attributed to the fact that some responses can be seen as inappropriate as well. So ritualized and repetitive habits, that's essentially, it can be repeating the same activities or movements or speech, habits of speech, which are almost always intended to reduce levels of anxiety, to create that sense of sameness, even when it might not seem to be socially appropriate. And that takes us to stimming, which is self-stimulation, where whether stressed or happy, rocking behaviour, any kind of hand flapping, any kind of repetitive, obvious behaviours. In fact, I've got a friend who, an autistic, late diagnosed female friend, who often talks about her stimming as her wish to hand flap when she's stressed, but she'll sit on her hands because she's obviously aware that that's not seen as appropriate by the neurotypical community, which in some ways is quite sad, that she just can't be herself. And that just gives us an indication of how our community feels, oh, they are defective and not different, because they are just different and not defective. Inertia and choice paralysis, you know, these issues of initiating tasks, of switching tasks, of being stuck in making a choice, things, these are executive skills, executive functioning skills that we as neurotypicals again take for granted, but we might think, why is that person not getting that? Why is that person, if I've asked that person to undertake a task, why are they not immediately doing it? And that's not taking into account perhaps some of the internal mechanisms that's creating difficulties, the cognitive load and the stresses that are happening internally. So again, it's about understanding, you know, the need for time to process, for time to initiate tasks, and also to understand some of the things that we might not get, which is the stress that actually comes from starting a new task, or switching from a task that you've already been doing to another one. Misunderstanding other people's intentions, again, that's social cognition. It's also social pragmatic disorder, which essentially is about some not understanding what other people mean about the subtext of what they're actually communicating, but it can also mean that responses can seem inappropriate because they're misunderstood. And that's a particular issue for what's sometimes called hyperlexic autistic people. Hyperlexic being what would formerly have been called high functioning or Asperger's, where you have individuals who have got a very high level of verbal capacity, very formal, very erudite, very, you know, really well composed. So there's an assumption made that the expressive language is as advanced as the receptive language, and in fact there's a mismatch. So many people who can speak a good game maybe don't always understand that game to the same level. So we've heard of autistic meltdown, shutdowns and burnout, and again, that's what comes sometimes as a result of just getting through a normal day. What does normal mean anyway? But just a typical day. A typical day for many of us can mean that we can be recharged by activities that many autistic people, even though they are positive, are not actually recharging them in any way, shape or form. They're actually taking, it's almost like think about a social battery. We'll come on and talk about the spoon theory, but think about a battery and think about how even a good activity, even doing something enjoyable, can be taken away, can be draining that battery. And that's why many neurotypical people misunderstand the levels of tiredness and exhaustion that neurodivergent people experience, even when there's been a positive event or occurrence. And I'll give you an example of that. One of my colleagues was doing a presentation, neurodivergent colleagues was doing a presentation at headquarters that was really well received, and she got loads of really positive feedback, but basically had to take a week to kind of come back down after it to de-stress after it, even though she really enjoyed it. And that might seem to some to be quite paradoxical, because for many neurotypicals that would be, really positive and recharging. That would be a recharging type of activity, a reaffirming activity. And we've already talked about co-occurrence with other conditions. So learning disability, 20%, ADHD, 50 to 70%, mental health, 70%, and many, many others. Autism comes with a whole load of other predispositions for epilepsy, for gastrointestinal issues, for autoimmune issues, for anxiety issues, for depression issues, loads and loads of other co-occurring conditions. So, to keep it as straightforward as possible, the autism spectrum, people talk about this spectrum all the time, and I think just as a way of kind of encapsulating this for yourself, it's often seen as the kind of low end of the spectrum, like we talked about, and the kind of high end of the spectrum. So somebody's less autistic or very autistic, which is actually quite nonsense. There's a beautiful quote by an autistic person that said, when they were using the terminology, the difference between low functioning autism or we'll say less autistic autism and very autistic autism is that the less autistic autism, your assets are ignored, and when you're very autistic, when you're very autistic autism, your deficits are ignored. So basically, the terminology that they used was actually high functioning, low functioning autism, but the point was that when we make assumptions based on this understanding of a spectrum from one linear part to another, that we discount even the people who seem to be coping well, seem to be getting along, seem to have resilience and coping capacity and are functioning on the surface very well, really are not having any issues. The reality is they are having issues, and that every autistic person to some degree or another will require adjustments and understanding and support. And that's why the diagnostic criteria and the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the International Classification for Diseases has been changed. So it's now autism spectrum, low, moderate or significant support needs. And that's really a much better way of looking at it, that autistic people are kind of essentially, they've got lower needs, moderate needs or higher needs. But the good way of thinking about it is the kind of the disc there, which is really about saying, look, these are the main areas where autistic people have challenges, but they also have areas of great strength, and different autistic people have had a completely different profile. Coming back to that quote of one word describing a million different stories. So from this diagram, you can see there's a kind of disc there of different areas of social differences and interests and sensory sensitivities and executive dysfunction. And one autistic person may have great strengths in some of those areas. For example, in that second circle there, somebody's interests, they've actually got, that they don't have many significant needs, but in others, they have quite a lot. So, excuse me, the diagram itself is quite self-explanatory in saying, right, look, with that red one, social differences, that person would seem to be, in quite a lot of need. Whereas when it comes to their perception, they've got less support needs. So that's a much better and straightforward way of looking at that. I hope I've described that as I kind of overly complexified that, I think. So in 20 minutes, I'm still trying to cram in as much as I can. So as a whistle-stop tour, cognitive load. This is just the spoon theory, which was actually used by an individual who was suffering from chronic ill health. And it's just been really, I suppose, adopted by the neurodivergent community because it's an excellent way of thinking about how we all go about our lives and what the cognitive load is in our daily lives, particularly our working lives. So basically when you are going through your day-to-day existence, you are expending your kind of dozen spoons, if you want to call it that, every single day. So you're spending 4 of your spoons on physical activities and 2 in your focus and 3 in your language. And, basically at the end of the day, you may well have used up all your spoons. But but that's unusual. Usually most neurotypical people will be replenishing their spoons during the day with activities such as that. But for the neurodivergent community, it's highly likely that at the end of each day, their spoons have all been used up. And that's why we see, autistic meltdowns, autistic shutdowns, autistic burnout, and ADHD burnout as well. We see that all the time. And it can be difficult, again, for employers and for colleagues and for family and for communities to understand what's actually going on. And it's just, you hear things like that, they're just a snowflake. They're just pretending. That's just somebody who's really kind of swinging the lead. And it's a complete and utter misunderstanding of a hidden condition that does create that kind of overload. So what does that overload look like? When autistic people are stressed, in fact, when neurotypical people are stressed, it's one of the 4 F's. We have this fight, freeze, flight, or fawn response. We all know what the fight or flight response is. Most of us are kind of quite familiar with that. Either we're going to stand our ground or we're going to run. And that has a kind of physiological effect and a psychological effect. The freeze is where we see an autistic shutdown. And that's quite characteristic of many autistic females, where that kind of freeze response, that kind of shutdown response, it can be seen as just dissociating. And that's obviously where many autistic females are traumatized as well. So we can see the freeze response in many autistic people, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, but the freeze response is something that's seen much more within autistic females. And obviously the fight, freeze, flight, or fawn response is not exclusively to neurodivergent people, but it's really important to understand how those responses are triggered much more easily and have a much lower threshold for many autistic people than they do for neurotypicals. The fawning response is another interesting one, because that's essentially telling people what they want to hear. And we see that all the time throughout the community, that kind of whole disguising, the chameleon, the camouflage effect, the masking, about, go along to get along. That's very much the psychology of many autistic men and women, but again, very prevalent in the female population. So go along to get along. Just say what you think people want to hear. And that can sometimes means...
I'm just noticing that time's getting on here, and that's 20 minutes.
Right, I'm nearly finished. Finished. So I shall bang on. Cognitive overload, we've already talked about that. Autism and terminology. Basically, the Promise report was produced a couple of years ago, and in that report, they said that language creates realities, and it does. We've talked about high function and low function and autism. We've talked about Asperger's, no longer clinical terms, and the difference between challenging, difficult, and distressed. I think that's a whole different conversation. PDA or EDA, we've mentioned that, sensory seeking and sensory avoiding. I think this is something that's quite useful. Do people have autism, or are they autistic? Overwhelmingly, the community is basically saying we are autistic. It's an identity. We don't have autism. It's not a disease, and it's about defining us in a medicalized way. And that's something the community wants the neurotypical community to know they don't want. Disability, difference, difficulty, or difficulty. I've mentioned that. And then when people say this is the classic, we're all a little bit autistic. Well, we're all a little bit on the spectrum. Basically, it's like saying you're mildly autistic is the same as being mildly pregnant. And many people want you to know that that's just a nonsense to say that we're all a wee bit autistic or a wee bit on the spectrum. So what's different about the Arch? This is where the radical social work comes in, and I just want to kind of quickly run through this. The asset-based community development approach is very much about bottom up, no top down. It's when we do things to communities, they experience it as a violation, but when you do it with them, they experience it as a liberation. So we are very much about collaboration, cooperation, communication, and co-production between all the stakeholders. It's about lived experience being the very centre of that. It's about advocacy for the community, by the community, and it's about moving from judgment to curiosity, so a rights-based approach. Crucially, for our audience, it's about drivers, engineers, and allies coming together. What does that mean? The drivers are the community itself, the engineers are the policy makers and organisations like UNISON, and the allies can be us all, everybody. family, professionals. It's about all those elements coming together to work for a common purpose, which is to create a better Scotland for our neurodivergent, a better UK for our neurodivergent community. And this is where Arch kind of aligns with the trade union movement. It's about discovering what the issues are. It's about connecting the community together. And then it's about mobilising that community to address those issues collectively. So, and I just want to conclude with this one here. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower.
Thanks, thank you very much for that. And lots of thoughts coming up from there. I'm going to move on very quickly because you took a little bit over time there to introduce John Whiteside. Hopefully, John, you're around. I saw you around somewhere. Great, good to see you. Thanks, John. Can I quickly introduce our second speaker, John, who qualified as a social worker in 2023, just a year ago. He was diagnosed with ADHD in his placement in 2022, and then started his job in South Lanarkshire a year ago and was diagnosed as autistic in 2023, just after starting his job as a social worker. So welcome here. He calls this double dunting, being diagnosed as both. And he described himself as having a big passion for radical social work, activism and advocacy. So this is a lived experience, some perspective from John. Thanks. Over to you, John.
Hiya, folks. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I don't know if you can see my slides.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Cool. Does it do the... there we go. Magic technology. It's beautiful. So, my name's John. I'm a newly qualified social worker, like Roger just said. I like to give everything a really snappy title, and post-diagnosis, I've been told many a time, you don't seem autistic, and I think that's due to my mannerisms, my humour, and the fact that I'm, in full-time employment. Roger kind of ran over the journey really quickly. I left school at 16, very minimal qualifications, started volunteering, ended up in my journey to social work, realised that uni was really difficult. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't really do much, a lot of that cognitive load type of stuff. And I got diagnosed with ADHD and started taking a stimulant-based medication that has helped me lose a lot of weight and also has helped me concentrate. So really, it's that's good. I graduated in 2023, and then I was diagnosed with autism just after starting my job in children and family social work in Hamilton and Larkhall. Big shout out to them. So the diagnosis itself, both diagnoses, had a really massive impact on my identity. And I think from speaking to other late diagnosed autistics and ADHDers and other neurodivergent folk, I've seen that as quite a common theme. And a part of me is still grappling with that, understanding, there's a lot of who am I? What's autism? What does autism mean to me? What does it mean to my behaviours? Because you're really digesting a lot of the feedback that you've received and the instruction that you've received throughout your schooling, your adolescence, and employment. So I want to speak first about the privilege that I have here of being employed and being autistic. 3 in 10 working age autistic people are in employment. That's compared to 5 in 10 disabled people and 8 in 10 non-disabled people. So folk with autism are really, really underrepresented in our workplaces, just like what Ramon said. And autistic people face the largest pay gap of all disability groups. I do have a reference for this afterwards that I shoved in, just so you know I'm not at it. So autistic people face the largest pay gap of all disability groups, which is 30% less. And that's typically because you're not seeing autistic people in high-paying professional roles. All of your celebrities with autism that are seen as role models. I won't get into how, you can't ethically be a billionaire and such, but they're not what we should be aspiring to. We should be aspiring to professionals, doctors, lawyers, the world's the oyster for my autistic brothers and sisters, and we're capable of more than being relegated to employment that doesn't fulfill us. There's so many barriers to employment if you're autistic. I like what Ramon said about interviewing being a social, it's a social back and forth. There's unwritten rules, there's subtext. If I don't know, big shout out to the STAR method of interviewing. If I didn't have that, I would have been absolutely gubbed. And that part of it is needing that structure, needing the subtext to be explained to me as part of my lived experience made interviewing really difficult, and it made it a barrier to employment. And then that employment has to be maintained, right? It's not just about getting in the door, it's about planting your roots and staying in the door. And I don't know about everyone here, but my first job was pretty traumatizing. I worked in McDonald's, I was 16, and the way that our school system sets us up is you have to have 100% attendance all the time. And so you're forcing yourself in, even though you're incredibly dysregulated, having a meltdown. And in my case, I didn't know I was autistic, so I just thought I was angry at the world for no reason. But there was a reason. It was McDonald's. It's smells, heat, flashing lights, noises. And the pay was shite. So it wasn't really worth it. And the references for this slide are the Buckland Review 2024. So what does autism mean for me? I stim when I'm stressed. Can you guys still see my camera? Aye. So my stimming looks like this. So I do that when I'm stressed, and I'm a frontline social worker in a children and families post. I'm pretty much stressed 90% of the time. So my colleagues can really see me walking about and doing that. And what's really interesting is I can see how it annoys them, and it's understandable that annoys them because they're experiencing their own form of sensory overstimulation. But I'm really lucky in that I've got colleagues who I love and who love me. And I'm able to be myself, but that's also a really unique position to be in. I become dysregulated easily, particularly when plans change, which is quite a common theme with autistic people. And it's that dual ADHD, you know, there's the ADHD side of me that loves to be impulsive and loves flying by the seat of my pants. And then there's the autistic side that's like, absolutely not. This has to be very regimented. And again, in frontline social work, plans change quite a lot. And I need a lot of support from my colleagues to help me manage that and to help bring me back down. Because if I didn't have them, I would be off sick. I become distressed when communication breaks down. And that's from a life of being told that I don't communicate well. And I actually think I do communicate well. I just communicate very bluntly and just pass information over directly. But apparently there's a song and dance you have to do when it comes to that. And I don't get it. But that's fine, because after a certain point in my career, people celebrate that and they go, I love the way your brain works. I love this. I love the way you just tell it like how it is. And there is an advantage to it in speaking to the families that I work with, because they appreciate the fact that I just call a spade a spade. I don't realise I'm calling a spade a spade. I'm just doing my day-to-day, but it's really useful. And I got the crap autism. So I don't think Big Bang Theory or anything, or Rain Man or anything, has really helped with the concept that, you know, of autistic savants, that, you know, if you've got autism, then you've got to be good at something. Unfortunately, I got the crap kind. I read 6 books at once. But other than that, I'm just an average guy. Because sometimes people look at the deficits of autism, and there's hundreds of strengths as well. There's so many strengths in regards to, like, for example, pattern recognition. But the media and the way the media portrays autism, what's that show, The Good Doctor or something like that, it's for me, and this is unique to me, but to me it is a disability. And that's not because of a deficit with me, that's because of the way the world is built around autism. I tell some of the young people I work with when I'm doing role modeling coaching, when you really break it down and call a spade, we're living in a world that isn't built for us. And it's the same for people with physical disabilities. A lot of people that need wheelchair access, unfortunately, are living in a reality that isn't suitable for them. And we try to make things better, but it's still an area that needs to change. So what do I think when I feel this way? When I'm displaying these behaviours, I don't celebrate myself. I'm a big advocate for autism, but I do feel intense feelings of shame, and I shouldn't do that. But the reason I feel those intense feelings of shame, and it's a really powerful word to use, but because that's not normal, and that's really, it's almost like, the way I think of it is like internalized homophobia, internalized misogyny, internalized ableism. Unfortunately, through my education and through the socialization, I felt like an alien from a very young age, and that made me feel not normal. And because there's very little in the way of neurodivergent representation in the immediate workforce around me, there's not many people around me to make me feel normal. So when people are celebrating me and bigging me up, at the end of the day, there's still, for me, a sense of othering to that. But still love it. Still love validation. I've got ADHD and autism. Like, it's absolutely class. But who actually cares about normal? Who actually cares? Like, there's a value judgment with normal, but it doesn't need to exist. So bringing the two things together, I coined the phrase radical autism. Whether that'll catch on, I don't actually know. And I really just wanted to use a really vibey heading. Oh, it's back again. Oh no. So we talk about neurodiversity, and neurodiversity comes, it's not just based on neurodivergence or anything like that. Neurodiversity comes from the diversity of lived experiences that we all have. I think definitely because I am a white working class man with autism, while a black middle class woman from the Caribbean with ADHD. When you take away the neurodivergence, we think differently from the experiences that have created us, the culture, the socialization, the way we were raised, and we celebrate the diversity. We celebrate diversity in the workplace because we know it works. We know having a diverse workforce is what gives us the best outcomes, and bringing neurodivergence into that can only give us better outcomes. And we need to reflect our communities. Neurodivergence is embedded into our homes, schools, and streets. It's very, actually, I'm just going to make a wild sweeping statement that's not built on any factual basis at all. Everyone knows someone that's neurodivergent in some way. Everyone's got a story about an auntie, a cousin, a friend. People know the communities that they stay in. And one of the biggest problems with social work is sometimes we don't reflect the communities that we stay in. You know, we are predominantly a middle class white profession, and we're not reflecting our community in that sense. So we need to do more to reflect our communities in multiple different senses. Autism, to be honest, it gives me an excuse to shed my professional identity in a way. I see for me, sorry, I keep getting distracted by chat. Even though all very, very valid questions, it gives me an excuse to shed my professional identity because I'm a little bit weird. And that's okay. I love being a little bit weird. I wouldn't change that for the world. I'm wearing my partner's belt because it's leopard print and it's vibey. I'm a little bit weird, a little bit atypical, and that gives me an excuse to shed that professionalism, which I think, in my opinion, is really important for radical social work practice. Where the social policing and the oppression that our service users feel coming from us, for me, I shed my professional identity as a way to build rapport and to seem more human. And my colleagues excuse that because they're like, he's just a little bit wacky. But any one of us is absolutely capable of doing that. And we can role model and learn from each other to be able to do that. Oh, where'd my slide go? Oh, no. Oh. So what I wanted to do here was, Ramon talked rightly about the autism community, the autistic community. So what I wanted to do was give an insight into the autistic community to see, and I think there's no better form of insight into a community, especially one like the autistic community, which is very much in online spaces, you know, Twitter, Reddit, etc., specific forums for niche hobby interests. You're going to see a lot of neurodivergent people represented there. So I've taken a couple of memes from different autistic pages to give you a sense of what the lived experience of other autistic people might be like. It's got the first, and it all refers back to what Ramon was saying and about how it intersects with employment. So me, a year into a job I'm asked my way into, there's a great degree of imposter syndrome in my experience, and I know other late diagnosed autistics are the same, of I have put on my mask and managed to make my way into employment, and I need to maintain this mask at all times, because if I get caught out, people are going to realise that I'm not normal and I'm going to get the sack. That was me for years. This is a classic one. The nature of communication. You turn around to a colleague and say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And someone will say, there's the value judgment added to it. It's lazy. But when you're breaking it down, sometimes you're just like, I don't want to do that because I've got my own stuff on. You know, I'm already chock-a-block. But you're just using that communication and people just see it as aggressive. And it's not necessarily the case. It's just very direct and to the point. It's a classic one for me. I talk a lot about my autism and my ADHD, almost like two wolves inside you fighting. And I do experience that as well. I overshare when I'm stressed. My colleagues must be sick of it. But then when I'm non-verbal and I'm stressed out in a different way, I've got a 1,000-yard stare and I look like an owl that's been caught out, for lack of a better metaphor. And this goes back to the imposter syndrome again. From a late diagnosed perspective, I still think I'm faking it because there are so many barriers to getting your diagnosis. There's so many hoops that you need to jump through, the evidence that you need to give. And then I think to myself, oh, I'm not that bad. And then you get to free yourself to be able to kind of lean into it almost. And then when you're leaning into it, if I'm leaning into my stimming, because I know it soothes me, part of me thinks, am I doing this performatively sometimes? Because I've got the label, so I need to be seen as autistic. I've digressed a wee bit, apologies. So I left a lot of time for a discussion and for a Q&A and stuff like that. So I rattle in. I don't know how this works.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, John. I was just about to jump in there and say, look, we're getting on, and it'd be really good to come to some of the questions that are in the chat. John Watson has been monitoring the chat. John, do you want to come in